going to sort
Okay. Okay.
Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason. With me today is my co-host Janelle Blue. Janelle is the president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, our sponsor. And our guest today is Char McCargo Bah. Char is a professional genealogist. She has a company called Finding Things for You, and she specializes in African-American research. And one of the things that I want to kind of point out to our viewers, unfortunately, African-Americans a lot of times did not get recorded in the records that the rest of us use. As an example, you may have a state where they have early vital records, but African Americans didn't necessarily get recorded in the vital records until much later. So this is an area that I know I, as a teacher, have struggled with trying to help people do their research. And I'm so glad for Char and some of the other people that I have encountered who can help me and help others to do research. So how did you fall into this is my first question.
I am one of the followers of Alex Haley. And when I was reading his book, never thought that about doing genealogy. It was never part of my thought patterns. And when I read Roots and saw the movie, though he did not have instructions how to do it, he just told his story. And I said, maybe it's possible. My father was already deceased, so I decided to do him first, since my mother was still living. And first thing I did was join a genealogical society.
Wow.
Because I needed the instructions how. You know, the book made it possible, it can be done, but not step by step. And when I joined the genealogical society, this older woman took me on her wing, and she was my mother genie. And so she took me to the National Archives, because we didn't have the online stuff back in 1981.
Right.
And when I started, and we would meet up at the National Archives. She walked me through the census. She explained everything to me. I talked to her every day for over 15 years.
Wow.
And she'll tell me, okay, honey, you're ready to go to this place now. Honey, did you do this? And so she gave me hands-on.
How far back were you able to take your father's family?
My father's family, I can take them back to in the 1700s, almost all of my lines.
No kidding.
Yes, but it's been over a 30-year process.
Yeah.
So it's not, because records were not available at the time. So whatever was available at the time, and when new records came out, I went back, to look at those. And luckily that most of my research is in Virginia, and I live in Virginia, so I did not have to travel like other people to a lot of other places.
Yeah, that's really helpful. All of mine are in one area too, so I kind of know to look for people that are in that area. So did you wind up doing as much as Alex Haley did when he actually went back to?
I haven't found the boat yet, so but through DNA, I do know the connection on my mother's side. My father's side is the story of being in America. It's all the ethnic groups, European ethnic groups that ended up in the DNA. My brother took the DNA, and he said, they can't trace my African side because I don't have enough of it in there. My father has European ancestry, and so that kind of stopped in knowing exactly maybe where in Africa through his DNA. Got Irish in there, Italian in there, everything, everybody else. So he said, lucky for mommy, mommy took us straight there. So my mom's DNA kind of put us in the Cameroons. Yes, and luckily for me, on my mother's side, I do have a picture from a distant cousin that we were related to. We have the same fourth great grandmother, and she had a picture of hers. So I know exactly what looked like it. My fourth great grandmother was her fourth great grandmother's sister, and so I have a picture. She gave me that picture before she died, and so that is the side that actually connects to the Cameroon. So I have at least an older picture of somebody who probably was in the U.S. It's a 17-something Their mother was born, so chances are I keep telling people, my folks probably came on the Mayflower.
Wow.
So I got another 100 years to go.
Yeah.
I got another 100 years to chase. But that's the closest one that I have to say that of an African ancestor who probably,
What did you have to do to get there? I mean, were there unusual research challenges that might be easier if you are always showing up in the census and always showing up in church vital records? Did you have some big obstacles?
Well, on doing African American genealogy, some people say, well, all genealogy is the same. That's true to a point. And so what happened is that you're going to do your basic genealogy step by step. And if you leave anything out, you're going to regret it when you get that brick wall, and you will get a brick wall. So basically, you go through all your censuses, your vital statistics, tax records, everything else you normally would do. Mm-hmm. When you get to the 1870, you just pray that you didn't leave nothing out, because now if they were enslaved, then you're going to have to identify them with a slave owner. So that's where the problem usually comes, is that a person would get to 1870, they don't know who the slave owner is, and then they got that brick wall. Yeah. And so also studying the history of the place your people come from, the state, the township, because chances are, in many cases, I find the slave owner in 1870 where they're living, unless they had a lot of migration, the slave owning families is going to be in that same general area. Sometimes they might be even still working for the family.
So can you then research the slave owners' records?
Yes.
And how successful is that? I know I've seen in some of the loose files in an archive, I've seen various documents that might mention a slave owner, but how frequently do you really find those records? Have they been maintained?
Well, the records in Virginia, they're very helpful, I would say, because I have researched other states, and I always have to think, this is not Virginia now. They don't have the kind of records that Virginia has. And you have to recognize that. If you've got multiple states, you just have to close down and shut down what you know about this state and learn everything about the state you're researching, because they might not have started their records at the same time.
I see.
In the state of Virginia, what I have found, this particular lecture I'm planning on doing at Fairfax Genealogical Society, is on me finding 5 different slave owners for one family through over a 200-year period of time.
What kind of records were you finding the information
I was able to identify who the slave owner through chancery records. Okay. Because that's another thing too, when you're doing your own genealogy, you have to remove yourself and act like you are the person who's being hired to research. Your emotions kick in, and get the fan, and you get hot flashes and all that when you're doing this now. You say, "Woo!" So what happened? You really have to remove yourself like it's someone else, so that you can see better, so you can analyze better. And what happened in this case is that when you're dealing with chancery records, which are equity court records, you're looking at your people being sold. You're looking at your people being up for collateral for any loans. You're looking for your people, the owners being sued. And if the other party wins, then they're going to be sold, because that was the cash. And so Virginia had a lot of it. And that's where I was able to identify the slave owner, because the slave owner lived beyond 1865. He didn't die until the 1880s. And I would never had a probate with their names on it if it wasn't for that chancery record, because he stayed in court. And our whole family was lined up, and their names were given to them as well. It was not saying that I have 10 slaves. It was saying that Joe, Linda, Belinda, just listing them all.
That's helpful.
Yes.
Wow. Well, I know that when I found one of those bills of sale, I mean, it was just horrifying to even touch that thing. And then when I told my client about it, she was horrified to think that her ancestor had slaves. And so it is an emotional thing that I guess you have to just kind of take a deep breath and overcome that.
If you're a drinking person, take a little shot of it. And then you say, "Ooh, okay, I'm moving on." But one of the things too is that the situation, we cannot change history. We only can try to research and understand it.
Right.
And if we trying to look to change something or trying to ignore it, you're not going to find anything about your family. So you really have to just, come to people. You separate yourself, and then you say, okay, I'm going to find them. When I first found it was oral history in my family about my great-grandmother. She had 8 children, and all of them were by the person that, first I thought she was enslaved, and was by her enslaved person. But it wasn't. It was after the Civil War. My grandfather was born in 1877. Her mother had died, giving birth to her, and she was a child servant. And she was working for someone who was not married, and he was like 40-something years old. He fathered all her children, and she started at the age of 9. That was oral history. I wrote it down. I said, "No, it doesn't happen." And then as I was trying to find her, I couldn't find her until after he died. Evidently, when the census taker came, she was never recorded. And then, soon as he dies, because my grandfather told his children the name of his father, so they all knew that. And so, when I looked for the person who was his father, he was in a household by himself. Then, when he dies, all of a sudden, my grandmother's there, and my grandfather, and all of his siblings. And so, when I had the documentation, I couldn't do the research. I was like crying. I was all sad. I mean, that was the first one I found. I was walking up and down the National Archives, and people said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Don't talk to me. Don't talk to me." And then for 2 months, I didn't do the research. And then something came over and said, mentally, spiritually, or whatever you want to take, and said, "If you don't do it, who's going to do it?
Do it.
Right.
Yeah.
If you're not going to bring them to life, who's going to do it? There's nobody in the family who's doing this but you." So then I took me a pill. I wish I was a drinking woman. I would have been over this early. And I said, okay. And so I was able every time to separate myself one after another. And I have found maybe, I want to say, in my years in my family, I want to say over 200 or 300 of my family enslaved. I found most of their slave owners. But it was like removing myself. Yeah. And it gets better as you're able to take it as you get better. But that first one was a doozy. It was a doozy. So, yes.
Well, and it's one of those things that people, unless they know the history, really don't think those things are going to be a part of their family's history. And, they do have those surprises.
Well, and also the slave owners didn't sometimes the slave was rented out to someone else. And so maybe for a year or 2 at a time, you wouldn't find them in a slave, whether slaves, there was a census for slaves, right?
How did that work? The slave schedule do not list them by name.
Oh, it doesn't.
It just says that this person has one of this age, and then basically physical look, mulatto or black, but do not mention them by name. So that's one thing. But hiring out, I found out that if a person died and his property was being probated or ended up in equity court, some of them, person who's taking care of the estate rented them out so he can make money, because the wife and the children would have to live while this process is going on.
Right.
And that's sometimes where you can get the names of some of the people that they hired out. So it's constantly looking in the court records, as well as looking at probate. If the owner, I used to give a lecture and say, if the owner dies before 1865, get up and do a dance, because that means his whole property is going to be probated. You're going to find your ancestor's name if he owned them, but quite a few of them live beyond 1865. So hopefully they had greedy children who went to court. Then you can dance again, because your folks is going to be listed.
And you only have the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules, so it's not a wide variety of schedules to assist. kind of 1850 for almost anything. It's beyond that, you can do things, but it's much, much more difficult because you only get the head of the household on the population schedule and then the breakdown. And
That's for federal records, but then you go to church. And I
Yeah.
just only discovered this maybe 10 or 15 years ago, finding which I call the mother church. Most of the African-American churches in rural areas came out of a white church. So as soon as slavery ended, 1865, between 1865 and 1870, they are asking to be dismissed from the church and start their own. Well, when they were listening, when they were enslaved, they listed them like, they'll say, like Anderson Kirby is one of the slave people, one of the slave owners of my people, and they had him in his church, Anderson Kirby, and then listed his servants. They call them servants, and my ancestors were listed right under him.
So are you saying that before the black churches were able to get to separate from the white churches, would you have been able to find a church record for the African American in the, that prior period? If there was like a birth record, would it have been recorded in the church book in the white church?
What I have been seeing with membership books, when the white owner went to church, he took some of his slaves with him. Okay. And that was like a, your favorite. It just was like a reward system. Yeah. You did, good work for me. You get a chance to go to church, because you're not going to work when you go to church, Right. And so what happened is that they recorded the owner and they listed who he brought to church with him.
Okay.
So that might be the first time you even see, and I have looked at ones that were 1840s, I have seen 1820s, where some other people were going to church with their owner. It was only one document I can only prove who the owner was of this particular ancestor. And I looked, ancestor, and his slave owner lived beyond 1865. So I'm sitting here, I had thought I knew who the owner was, but I didn't have documentation. It was that one church record where the owner went to church. Out of all his slaves, he only took one slave, and it was my ancestor he took to church. Oh, man. And his name was mentioned.
Now, was there a predominant religion that most of them were members of? Like, were they Baptist or?
Some of them end up being in the same religion as their owners. So the owners was Methodist, they Methodist. Then later on, they might have gone to Baptist. Most of them, the early ones, practiced religion the way they practiced religion when they were in the continent, and sometimes they would get the pots. You might have heard of pots, and they were, they'd be worshiping very loud, but they didn't want their owners to hear, so they would do it and put their head in the pot to muffle the sound, sound of the so they cannot be heard.
I know within the Methodist church that I grew up in, we had the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Originally it was the Methodist Episcopal Church.
And when you find a African American that is a Methodist, who's been a Methodist for a long time, you're going to find, chances are, you're going to be able to record them, because the Methodists did record very well. Black Baptists, the records are very weak. Many of them were illiterate, and came out of slavery illiterate and did not have a sense of record keeping. And many of them have memorized the Bible. And some of them were even being trained as ministers when they were slaves. And the master would sit there and oversee the ceremony, but they have memorized it. So when it came to recording the names and recording, of things, it wasn't there. So.
You and I were talking a little bit about, for instance, George Washington and the idea that it might be maybe an hour's carriage ride from Mount Vernon to that church in Old Town Alexandria where they went. And it had never occurred to me until you mentioned that surely they brought some of their slaves with them, because there were tasks to be done and things. And so I don't know, is that a situation where those people might have been recorded in some way?
Yes, they could have been recorded. Alexandria had a large freed population, but many times when people came to Alexandria, especially for meetings, and many of them were in politics or whatever, they used the different stables to, leave their horses, and they had their own servants who probably they if they didn't have quarters for them to stay in, they would stay with their animals there.
Oh my goodness.
So but Alexandria had a lot of taverns. One that I recently found out up there near Fairfax County on Duke Street. It was in Fairfax County back then, but it's what called CATS, C-A-T-T-S Tavern, and it was right next to one of the well-known slave traders. And people would stop at that tavern to rest, to check in, and they will leave their horses in the stables, and then next to it, they had a place where the slaves would be kept. So, and that seemed to be common practice, and that's something I think we overlook when we do research, is that looking at maps and seeing exactly what was there. What was there. If you knew that your ancestor was passing through, what possible place could he have stayed, and everything. And in this case, if they had slaves with them, they had to put them someplace, Or sometimes they slept in the room with them at the foot of their bed, or something like that.
And that's where learning the history of the area, like you said, is so important to know. And unfortunately, we don't have Sanborn fire insurance maps and others as far back as we would like to, but that in itself is so important to look at those. I learned something about a piece of property that one of my sister and brother-in-laws lived on, that everybody thought it was just a concrete slab that somebody who owned the house used to put a picnic table on. No, originally in the 1920s it was a garage.
Oh, wow.
And I only learned that by seeing the Sanborn map and the fact that it was on the garage. And of course they would, in those, put the outbuildings and things, not just the main structures on them.
So you've done a lot of cemetery research in Alexandria, and you've even written a book, I think, about that. And so how far back, and where is that cemetery, and how far back does that go?
Cemetery is on Washington and Church Streets in Alexandria. And the cemetery, I have a dispute in when it actually became a cemetery, but the city says 1864. I think, knowing African Americans, they're going to start using something before it's recognized by the county. So I believe they were burying people there before that time. But the city goes with 1864. And I was hired to find descendants. Now, luckily for that particular project, what exists is the Gladwin records. Gladwin was the chaplain who buried the people in that cemetery. In order for him to get paid, he had to record their name, and then he turned it in, and that's how he got paid. So that ledger with all the names still exists at the Library of Virginia. So we have the names of those people. I was born and raised in Alexandria, which kind of helped a lot with this research, but my family migrated there. My parents migrated there, and our last name being McCargo. When it was time for me to go into the community to talk, somebody said, "I don't know no McCargos." You're not a home girl. I said, oh my God, it's not going to be as easy as I thought it was. So what happened, and I approached people I went to school with and had their parents vouch for me. So when somebody said, "I don't know who the McCargos are," I said, "Do you know Miss Sanders?" They said, "Yes." I said, "I'll have her call you." And she would say, "Oh yes, girl, she's a friend of my daughter, and she went to school with her, and she graduated from T.C. Williams." And so that took time. That took about 2 to 3 months. So once I got the blessings, and then I was able to do the research, because even though we would consider oral history, I needed to hear their story.
Sure.
How long, I needed people to tell me they've been in Alexandria, if my age group, they needed to be in Alexandria at least 3 to 4 generations to even think about possibly connecting to that cemetery. I knew I had Joneses there. I knew not to even touch that. I went for all unusual names first. Then I found the unusual names married Joneses and married, whatever. Yeah. So what happened is that, Drayton. Drayton is a surname that I'm familiar with that comes out of South Carolina. It was a huge Drayton plantation there. But we had a Drayton that was in Alexandria who buried a child at the Freedman Cemetery. And I just knew this Drayton must have came up from South Carolina. I was wrong. He came from Massachusetts. Why he came here, he was like in the wrong direction, you know.
He got lost.
But he came here. I said, well, maybe he was part of the colored troops. I could not find documentation whether he was or not. But anyway, his descendants still live in Alexandria, and they connected. Alexandria being small, once I see the name and I knew the people I went to school with, I saw a lot of their surnames, like Haskins. I went to school with Haskins. It was Haskins who buried there. I had to research them to see whether they'd been there for at least 4 generations for that time period. And then looking at their early ancestor here, and then researching. Some of the people who were buried there, they'll put their mother's name. They'll say the mother brought the child there. Some will say the father, but many didn't have. They just have the person's dead. Some of them have infant with the last name. And some of them just say stillborn with no name. So you'll never be able to find who that stillborn connects to.
So this was really established after the Civil War.
During the Civil War, 1864, and it went into about 1868, 69.
So if you were researching someone who would have died prior to that, you wouldn't have found them in like a normal cemetery, or would you have found, were there established black cemeteries prior to that? I guess if they were free.
Yeah, if they were free, they buried. They were buried in whatever cemetery that was available, but they were buried in this colored section. Okay, so each one had a section that was like a colored section.
Okay, so that's what you would look for.
And it was associated with their churches, because the Methodists had a section where they buried, and then they separated St. Mary Catholic Church, that's on Washington Street. They have a colored section in their cemetery.
And we have run out of time. And this has been so interesting,
So very
and I have still learned from you, and we're so glad that you were able to come and join us and share your knowledge so that our viewers have some understanding of. And I can now say to students, go watch this show, because I'm always trying to find sources. So.
And please come to the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We meet the 3rd Tuesday of every month. We have great speakers, and you are certainly welcome. We also have a great research center, so please come.
Thank you.